Okay, welcome to part 2 of our core strength series, where I wanted to break down some of the beliefs circulating around core strength, especially like how it must be an exercise that tries to annihilate your abdominal section. That's pretty much the thinking behind most people's exercises, just in the belief that if their abs are stronger, or if they train their abs like a bicep curl for the bicep, that their core gets better, which is just not true. So I'm going to show you a series of exercises starting in no particular order. Probably the first ones are a bit easier, but there's a couple that are a bit tricky. And this first one is sort of moving from our phase 1 exercises where we were, like the more typical things of side planks and horse stance exercises, lower abdominal, leg lowering and stuff like that. This one being the inline lunge drill, and Kim demonstrating it here, is a perfect example of the core being challenged as we start to progressively narrow her stance, but also take away the things that she would rely on, being mainly her eyes. And this is when you start to see the core work in a reflex capacity, which is more or less what it's designed to do. So you can start to see it there, where as we've sort of, this last part now is where she's going to shut her eyes, and we'll start to see a lot more challenge. Breathing will change as she tries to prevent her body from swaying rapidly to one side and making her lose balance. So she makes this look really easy. If you try this on your own, you'll realise how difficult this exercise can be, especially if you're someone with stiff hips or have relied on your hips to create your stability in the past. So I'm going to break this down. I'm just going to go back a bit for you. So when she has to move her leg from going from this stance here, and then she moves herself, so she's going to try to move to the other side now. You'll see this in slow motion quite well, is that before her leg can lift off the ground, right at this point, all her weight is moved to that right-hand side. All right, so she's sort of in a straight line like that to allow enough room for this leg to move in front. Now, for that leg to move in front, all of this midsection here and also there, so because remember the obliques are working diagonally across, so you've got external obliques on one side and internal on the other side, and they're trying to really work as a team to prevent her from falling out to the side, which is the most obvious place she's going to fall. But at the same time, you've also got like this sort of multi-directional thing, because the trunk flexors, if they're over dominant, which are the common rectus abdominis used in the sit-up, that's going to actually pull her forward and she's going to face plant. So she's also got that challenge of the back extensors behind combating with the trunk flexors, and all of these guys are trying to actually prevent movement. This is what we would call stability. And it's not, she doesn't really feel any of her abs destroyed as such. It's just that they're working as though they're designed. Now the hip, and this is where people who have trouble with who have learnt to get their stabilization from their hips are found out with this exercise, because if they're using that to create the stability of their trunk, when their leg is like this, if this hip is dominant, it's going to move her around, and because there's no way the hip can control through the trunk and through the lumbar spine and controlling the upper body. It's going to ruin it. So this is a great exercise for a person who's hip dominant with their stability to learn how to correct it. And this is one of those exercises that doesn't need coaching. You just need to make mistakes and learn from them. All right. So this is an excellent example of core stability working with reflexes and not through conscious thoughts and trying to hold it rigid like a plank. All right, so that's the inline lunge. So if we sort of take that lunge position and go from a reflex position to now where there's actually more strength involved. The minute we stand, because we involve the feet, there's now an extra joint that can really ruin everything that's now heavily involved. And obviously the strength is actually a much bigger element. So that last one really needed minimal strength. This one needs a lot of strength, especially if you're someone who's lacking it. So Kim does it it's quite a simple, we all know what this is just a normal lunge. And basically it's a great core exercise in its own right for the same reason as the other one, in that we are trying to keep that nice upright posture, the hip well aligned, the strength will be sort of driven on the front leg. The front leg does 70% of the work, all right, in the lunge. It's 70% is driven by that front leg. The back leg, most people might feel if they're hip dominant, because they're relying usually on their hips to give them the stability, and now it's been removed from that. All right, but this in its own right is a great core strength exercise that's heavily underrated. All right, because everything we saw on the last one has to happen now, but now we need strength. Now, to take this up one notch, and this is sort of moving actually probably quite a few notches, this is where if we add load into the other side, into the upper body on the other side, this is where from phase one, where we were talking a lot about the slings, this is where we start to see that sling. So again, when we walk, our left leg moves forward in combination with our right arm. The thing that holds it together is through the core, through the abdominal section, the obliques especially. All right, but there's no one set of muscles that's working on its own. It's the sequence that's important. So in this exercise, Kim's going to come up from a lunge and stand in one leg, moving that dumbbell up ahead. So the timing, again, I'm going to say this so many times, the timing is very important for the efficiency of these exercises for you to do them efficiently. All right, if anything's out of time or out of alignment, it ruins everything, and then small muscles that are not designed to work are now going to be forced into doing it. All right, so you can see as she comes up from the lunge, the strength driven through the legs, and so all the energy is driven through the legs, up through the core onto the other side. This is exactly what you would see with a basketball player who does a slam dunk or a layup, or a high jumper trying to jump. We would jump from the left leg and reach with our right arm because it's the most efficient way to move. All right, so there's a system that combines that to make it efficient, and it's the core. So you don't need to hammer it with isolation exercises to get the most out of it. You just need to be in positions that demand it to be used that way. Now, if we come into a rotation movement, so this is a woodchop exercise in a kneeling position. In this sort of tall kneeling position, they call that, quite simple. There's really not a lot that can go wrong. Probably the main thing that we would see probably do is we see how she's got her arms like that, which is good. We might see too much elbow flexion if the weight's too heavy as well, where they've got it too close to them. In this case, we're actually wanting her arms a fair way away from her to create a lever. The lever is what sort of challenges the core the most, and she's sort of coming in this diagonal pattern again. I prefer these woodchops to always be like a diagonal that way or a diagonal that way. I very rarely go straight across. When you go straight across, that's when we start to see things like disc tears. So not a disc bulge, but a tear. When you're coming diagonal, it actually is much more efficient and doesn't stress the discs so much. All right, so this is a simple exercise, but it leads into two harder versions, which she'll show us in a second. But again, the timing, the position, the posture is good. So again, what we saw before, if you're flexing over all the time, you'll find these exercises difficult, and you'll find things start to hurt that shouldn't hurt. Now, when we come into the half kneeling position, this is when we start to see the issues of the lunge coming out. Now, this is where we would often see people forcing this hip out to the side because it makes the weight seem lighter, but really what's happening is they're buckling their spine. All right, so the cue for this is to actually sort of force this hip back that way so you're staying dead straight. And Kim does a reasonably good job at this. We could probably be a little bit more strict on her, but she's reasonably good. This leads into problems we see with single leg stance, and especially cutting drills in sports, where we would see, if I just take that back a bit, where we would see, you start to sort of see her on one of these where we get a little bit of that shoulder sway. I think it's on this last one, just as she comes back, and you'll see that there's a little bit of a tweak of her upper body. I didn't quite see it then, but basically what we would see in a single leg stance is that falling out. This exercise is trying to prevent that. This is like an anti-rotation exercise. Now the harder version of this is the standing woodchop. And this is now when you're having to integrate, so now the legs are a problem. If there's issues at the legs, it actually compromises through the upper body and the core. All right, so again, the timing is everything on this. Those last two, we could sort of use a bit of a slower movement. This time it must be fast. That lever still needs to be quite a fair way away from you. You don't want to see any elbow bend. And the legs have got to be, there's got to be a weight shift. See how she's got all her weight on that left leg, and this leg's fully extended. There's just no weight on this side. That's exactly what you would see with someone who plays baseball, even the pitcher. So hitter or pitcher, golf even, but there's a transfer of weight. The transfer of weight is what gets the force produced through the legs and then out through the core and into the arms. The arms are the weakest part, right? The strongest part is always your legs. Your job is to try and get the strength from there to go through the body and out the arms. So if she was throwing something or she had an axe in this example, the axe would be moving rapidly fast to cut the tree down. All right, so this is a perfect example of why timing is way more important than strength. The positioning of her legs and her body and then the speed at which she does it are what create the force. All right. Now, so far we've looked at a lot of lunges and rotation stuff. So in our phase one, we spoke a lot about bracing, all right, and that was just a stepping stone for learning bracing in the real movements, which are, in this case, bending or deadlift in the gym and squatting. So this is now where you're learning to use the core to prevent compression. So we don't want to see these discs compressed, the spine buckling on itself, creating problems either at the disc or the SIJ joint, which is often gets squashed itself, and even issues at the thoracic spine because it'll move out and then it will become rigid. So learning how to use the breathing strategy within the bending movement. So how you use that in the horse stance exercise, the forward ball roll. Now you're trying to execute that breathing pattern or breathing engagement into the movement of picking an object up. So obviously you'd want to spend a bit of time with the deadlift to get comfortable with the movement. We could probably be a little bit more strict on Kim here and get her to straighten her legs to get a little bit extra movement, but generally she's pretty good. All right, I'm pretty confident that she's doing that well. So she's got a nice alignment. Remember, we always keep saying positioning, timing, everything. All right, so she's in the right position. Now, as she's about to lift that, if you remember from the first video, there's that ribs sort of, when she activates, like as if she's going to get punched in the stomach, the obliques sort of push out to the sides. The diaphragm lifts up and it holds it's like a belt being wrapped around her core there. Now her back is safe to lift and her legs will do the work of lifting it. It's not her arms that are lifting it, it's her legs. All right, but if any of those things break down, someone else is going to do it, and it's most likely going to be the lumbar spine that takes the load. All right, so the timing of the breathing within the positioning and the timing of the movement are everything. All right, so if we go from the deadlift to the squat, and they look very similar, but they're very different. All right, so in the squat, there's a lot more knee movement. All right, so this is a hell of a lot more work through the quadriceps in this movement. So for some people, it can be a little bit more trickier to find that nice posture. But yeah, so if we're just doing a simple dumbbell squat here, but if we could progress this to a barbell, then there'd be even more compression added to her spine and to her whole body, to be honest. So what we're looking for here is on her breathing again. So as she's coming down, so the positioning's got to be right with the squat. So she would practice this with body weight before we would add load. So positioning's perfect, all right, because you can see here, there's her spine, there's her shins. That's perfect. That's a beautiful squat. When she's at the bottom there, we've got to see that bracing strategy again, where the obliques are kicking out to the side and her diaphragm lifts up and in to create that belt feeling. She would do that right at the bottom. That's where she would have a little bit of a hold of the breath. As she comes out, she would breathe out to release it. And as she goes back into it, she would she'll start to build pressure right about now, building, and really holding it nice and tight here, now releasing. That is a core exercise that would beat all of the sit-ups that you could ever do, because this is how you're learning to use the core in the way it's designed to be used, and also where we see it break down and cause trouble and injury. All right, so now this last one, we've featured this one many times before, and this is just the simple toe touch drill. And again, this brings into play the thing we saw at the very beginning with that inline lunge. The only difference is the foot is added to this. So the foot being added to the mix creates a whole set of problems where the person might have executed everything perfectly with all the other things up till now, because this is the first time we've actually been on one leg, and now the foot, if it's lazy or dysfunctional in any way, it'll actually set off a chain reaction and ruin all the other joints, even though they had nothing wrong with them. The pain will sort of head up, or the dysfunction will head up away from the foot, and usually into the ankle, the knee, the hip, and then the spine. All right, maybe sometimes in a different order. All right, but this is a classic example of when we're in, this is the stance phase of walking. So you can see here, that'll be where if she was normally walking, she's got to have good stability through the foot, the ankle, the knee, the hip, and the trunk. So this is a core exercise that is really, 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 really important. Even though you don't feel the abs burning, it's actually working in reflexes to hold you, to prevent you from all this falling out, shifting the hips, doing weird stuff. And the best part is you've got all these joints heavily involved that all need to do the right thing at the right time. I regard these exercises as much more beneficial than any of the ones on the floor. Just sometimes it's too difficult to use these because there might be pain, or the person's coordination or lack of strength is just an issue. So they're too difficult because of other reasons. So I use the other exercises as stepping stones, but if the person's already good at those exercises and has capabilities, I will prefer them to learn core stability within these movement patterns than lying on the floor. Learning how to, so as she's moving her foot around, where this point here would be where she'd need to be the most stable. All right, so she would use that breathing thing we discussed in the squat right now, because that's where she's challenged the most. As she brings the foot in, this point here is the easy part, so she can relax. So she's going instantly from relaxed to stable and stiff, but just for a split second, not holding it for a minute stiff. All right, if she tries to hold her core stiff for this entire time, she's going to lose it. It doesn't work that way. It must relax to then engage. All right, so I hope this video gives you a bit more understanding of when we're talking about the core, it's more than just the abdominals. All right, and when you really understand that concept, you really start to develop your training to levels that are much more than you've ever seen before, and you realize that you don't need to spend time on the floor unless you're injured or you're incapable of standing. If you're capable of standing, learn how to get your breathing to engage in these patterns, and you won't need to waste your time on the floor with all these other exercises that most people believe are core training. All right, so I hope you've enjoyed that video, and there'll be maybe a couple more that we'll release on with some extra stuff on the things that I haven't included. All right, we'll see you next time.